Hi, welcome to this webinar with Tunza Games and Georgina Lamb from David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation. So a chance to hear more about what David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation are doing to protect wildlife in the wild, which will be really interesting. So Georgina, actually thinking about it, do you want to do a very quick overview of what David Shepherd does first, and then we can go into the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Richard, so much for obviously having us with you today. So David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation was established 35 years ago by my grandfather, David Shepherd, who was a well-known and world-renowned wildlife artist with the aim to protect endangered species in their natural habitats. So we very much focus on holistic conservation, which is fighting wildlife crime. So it's working with ground-based projects. It's also looking at tackling the illegal wildlife trade, so working in demand countries and also looking at the trafficking routes from source to those ultimate destinations. So we have a number of projects across Africa and Asia, and we focus on 8 core species of endangered mammals.
All right, great. I actually still have a signed sketch of a gorilla from David Shepherd years ago at one of the events that's still on my wall as pride of place. So yeah, known about you for quite a long time. So actually just getting into the work that you're doing. So how important is the work that you do with local communities, both to alleviate poverty, but also to reduce human-wildlife conflict? And then what sort of projects do you do to provide support?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's absolutely essential and vital. And at the core of all the project work that we support across Africa and Asia, when we're talking about grassroots conservation projects, it absolutely has to engage with local stakeholders. And when you're looking at poverty alleviation, it's one of the major drivers for illegal activity, whether that's poaching or bushmeat or just snaring for simple survival for subsistence poaching. And there's a big misconception, I think, in conservation a lot of the time that the poachers are always demonized and to be made to be these really awful people, but a lot of the time it is purely down to survival and feeding families. So you're looking at any type of long-term solutions in conservation, you have to be engaging with communities around alternative livelihoods and making sure that they, as the custodians of the wildlife and the natural spaces that we're all trying to protect, are absolutely engaged in the process and that they're positively benefiting and, more importantly, have a really positive relationship. Otherwise, we're looking at short-term solutions to a huge problem. So it's absolutely key, and whether that's through employment or it's through microfinancing programs or community schemes around empowerment and giving communities a voice. It's the only way that we're going to win a lot of these battles with some of these criminal syndicates and poaching that happens on such a vast scale in a lot of these locations. I think the local communities are also sometimes what we call your first line of defense. So in a lot of the places that we work, it's absolutely about investing in those communities, because when poachers come in, they're the ones who know if there's any unusual activity or if there's any people who have come into the village who wouldn't necessarily have normally been there, and they're your first line in terms of not only reporting but also making sure that those incursions don't happen and can be stopped before then the poaching occurs, where you are then obviously dealing with loss of life rather than preempting it. So we absolutely at David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation believe that communities are key, and you have to be working with local stakeholders. There's no way that we should be sitting over here in the UK, for example, talking about conservation strategies for a protected area in Kafue in Zambia, or whether it's in a local park in India, for example, if you're not absolutely leading with the stakeholder engagement at that local level. And we've seen some incredible positive stories that have come out for it. We work in Zimbabwe with Painted Dog Conservation, which is an incredible project, which is very much around positive reinforcements with communities. So there's this incredible relationship that they associate with the survival and the health of the dog populations, the painted dogs, with the health of the communities and the investment and the help and support that they can get. And they run something called an educational bush camp. And it's amazing now, the kids who went through 10, 15 years ago are now coming out and some of the most vocal advocates for painted dog conservation, because they've seen that absolute positive benefit that can be brought to the communities in the local area. So yeah, it's absolutely key. And in terms of then also, the second part of your question, Richard, around human wildlife conflict, again, it's very easy for us to sit from afar and have a, you know, a judgmental view about, well, it's awful, you know, why are there retaliation killings? But if you're dealing with a herd where your entire income and livelihood is based on the value of your herd and keeping that safe, and you know, you have a snow leopard predation, then you're bound to have a negative relationship potentially with that species. So in order to avoid, you know, an escalation of human wildlife conflict, whether it is retaliation killings or whether, for example, it's crop raiding in India or Africa with elephants, which can have huge damage to properties which are built in the natural migration routes of elephants, for example. So, you know, there's no blame from the species part or the elephants, for example, but coming up with either early warning systems or ways that, you know, rather than calling it, you know, human-elephant conflict, for example, there's a fantastic colleague of mine who calls it human-elephant coexistence. And it's around coming up with ways that both can benefit. You know, we have an explosion of human populations. We can't ignore that. And of course, the encroachment, therefore, into protected areas is only going to increase. It's not going to decrease. So we do have to come up with really clever and innovative solutions that try and address that. And some of the things we're doing, for example, we've funded some work in India through early warning systems with smartphones. Everyone nowadays has a smartphone. And so there's a huge pilgrimage route, and this is with the Wildlife Trust of India, who are a fantastic organisation, where huge numbers in there, tens of thousands of people at a certain time of year make a natural pilgrimage through a protected area where you have tigers, elephants, reptiles, you know, a huge array of species. And it's around setting up these cordons where if a species is seen, then there's an alert system, which means they can just redivert, or you can have special wildlife teams who are used to dealing with the safe prevention and, you know, pushing away, for example, an elephant herd if they're coming too close to a village, rather than this, you know, terrified reaction, which is totally understandable. For example, if at night an elephant comes in and is destroying your entire livelihood, you're bound to, you know, sometimes come up with this negative response, which then results in a lot of cases where either the human is seriously at risk, or sadly the wildlife either gets killed or, you know, is hugely traumatized. So people are key. You know, conservation, we all do it because we love the wildlife and we love the animals, but it's absolutely about the people. And I think it's definitely something that we've seen in the conservation sector, people realizing more that you absolutely have to be working with people. Whilst we're the problem, we're also the solution. So yeah, it's something that's really, really important to DSWF.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I particularly like the notion of coexistence as well, that it doesn't have to be conflict. You can actually see it, and those early warning systems to address things are going to happen, but actually you can genuinely mitigate them. And yeah, the importance of community as well. As you know, when I first started out, I thought it was all going to be about wildlife. You spend all your time with animals, and then you actually work out you don't. It's literally so, yeah, really interesting insight. So the question too is a little bit different, but I suppose it leads on from there. When outside of that community space, there's still going to be the presence of organised crime groups coming in to poach the illegal wildlife trade. So rangers are traditionally that sort of front line of conservation against that more criminal poaching. So what do you do to support rangers in the field?
Yeah, and again, you know, it's one of our core pillars, which is community, law enforcement, and then education. So the law enforcement piece for us has been at the heart of what we do in the DNA of the foundation since we started. We recognise that you absolutely have to empower and equip rangers who, you know, at the end of the day, they are at the front line in the war against wildlife crime. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they are going up, as you say, against serious criminal organisations who are well-funded, who are well-supported. And a lot of the time, these guys are working in environments or locations where they're under-supported and under-resourced by the government, just purely because of a lack of income and ability to provide equipment. And yet you're expecting them to go out and to protect the wildlife in some of the most challenging and harsh environments in the world that we almost can't imagine on a daily basis with very little. And I think for us, there's two parts of it. The first is just basic welfare. You know, no ranger should have to go out and do a 27-day stint, or, you know, 14-day stint, for example, with odd boots or with holes in their boots, or with a rain jacket that doesn't keep the rain out. You know, we wouldn't be expected to, you know, to carry out our jobs doing that. So we should never expect the same of them. So a lot of our work is, it's not always supporting the kind of sexy headline, you know, big tech solutions, but it's absolutely about making sure these rangers feel supported and valued. And that welfare support, which is really key through a lot of our projects, is really important to us. You know, when you have people who are feeling supported and there's a good welfare scheme, you know, they do a better job, and there's less temptation, you know, buy bigger cash, for example, to go to the other side, where actually you can make far more money poaching rather than being the protector. So it's really important investing in these ranger communities. And likewise, in a lot of places, we mentioned in the last question around India, you get these volunteer village defence forces who are incredible, who are going out on a volunteer basis to protect the wildlife, because there is such a growth and an escalation in wildlife crime. And they're doing it in their own time because they feel that they need to protect, you know, what is theirs and living on their doorstep. But they don't have the provisions to buy raincoats, to buy torches, to make sure that they've got communication. So, for example, if they are away from their family, or if there's an incident, or if they need, you know, an emergency response, they need to be able to have that in place. So that's a really big thing for us, and through all of our projects, law enforcement support at that very basic level up is really key. So we very much focus on basic welfare as a key provision, and then you can build on top of that. So you then look at supporting more specialised, for example, intelligence-led units, and there's an incredible one in Zambia who we work with the Department of National Parks and Game Rangers International, called SAPU, which is the Special Anti-Poaching Unit, and they are absolutely targeted at intelligence-led investigations. So they're different to the conventional anti-poaching, who would go in and just transect national parks and cover ground by just patrols. They're very much information-led, so they build up this incredible network of informants, and when they get sign, or, you know, for example, there's pangolins or ivory, or there's some type of trafficking news, they could be much more direct and much more efficient. And so they do require an extra level of equipment, mobility, communication, and training. So the training component is also a big element of that. And we very much try and do it. So we run a joint program with a number of other organisations, including with a veteran organisation here in the UK, around taking ex-veterans and wounded soldiers out to do training. So it's an empowerment piece for both, rather than just flying in, you know, big contractors to deliver high-level training that isn't necessarily targeted or appropriate for that level. There's no point, you know, having very, very sophisticated American or British, or, you know, wherever it is, tacticians going in talking about, you know, the use of a grenade launch, which I have seen happen in certain places in Africa, when actually they have 6 bullets in a gun that barely even fires. So it's absolutely about making sure that we're being sensitive as well to the local conditions and environment, and working with our ground-based partners who absolutely understand that. And then there is also obviously then the big part around law enforcement and ranger training, which does look at those more sophisticated technologies and solutions, which are, you know, drones, or, you know, infrared. You know, it depends where you are and where you're operating. But again, you know, we always come back to, there's no point having a very sophisticated drone, or, you know, this technology, if, for example, they don't have charging points and they can't charge it when it runs out of battery. I think we have this wonderfully romanticized view sometimes of the locations that these guys are working in, that they get to go home and charge their phones, and they get to charge all the, you know, a lot of the time they are literally in a tent, if not even in a tent, in incredibly difficult landscapes. And, you know, as we said, they can go up against poaching gangs who are armed with far more sophisticated weapons. Or on the other flip side, they are going up against local bushmeat poachers, and we've seen in Africa some of the homemade weapons that they use. And I mean, it's incredible. They're these shotguns made of just wood, and I mean, how 90% of the time I think the actual user ends up, you know, sadly blowing off their arm rather than the other way around. But the innovation around people who are desperate, needing to poach. So it's also understanding the balance of when rangers should, and at what level of force they should intervene. And ideally, obviously, it's always to preserve life, whether that's human or wildlife. So rangers are the key. You know, they're the ones who are stemming the bleeding at the moment. Whilst we absolutely need to be looking at, you know, government policy and government reform, it's rangers who are on the ground who are stemming the bleeding of the poaching epidemic, and they are absolutely key in this fight. And it's also not always just about the rangers. We try and celebrate a lot of the support teams that are there to support the rangers. You know, we have again this image of a, you know, an African bush scene with men going out, you know, in their khaki camouflage to protect rhinos or elephants. But actually the teams behind, who are the ones who are collecting the data, who are doing the monitoring, who are making sure that, you know, the rations and the provisions, and that there's fuel in the car for an emergency response. There's a huge team that goes behind actually what a ranger is able to then deliver. And at DSWF, it's absolutely about supporting a lot of those unseen and slightly more boring but essential operational costs, and that's something that we've always been really pleased and proud to support, because it's not always the biggest, most attractive, funding solutions for international aid sometimes. So yeah, ranges are absolutely key, and it's something that we are incredibly proud of at all of our projects. There is always, very rarely, unless it's a very bespoke project, there's absolutely always a law enforcement element, because we're dealing with every 15 or 20 minutes an elephant is poached. There's 300 pangolins taken from the wild every day. Rhinos have never been more persecuted. So we're dealing with a scale that is unprecedented, and poaching that is absolutely unsustainable. And if we don't see a major change now, we won't be talking about elephants being on the verge of extinction. There won't be any elephants left, and it's the rangers who are absolutely at the front line who are keeping these last stronghold populations safe. So they are the unsung heroes of absolutely of the conservation world. But it needs to be, in conjunction with all the other elements and aspects. But they absolutely need all the support and the acknowledgement that they are given, if not 10 times more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, particularly interesting how it's often those really small, simple things that make the big difference. As you say, so many people aren't aware of that rangers will go out without a raincoat, without a malaria net if they're going into a distant location or whatever. Actually, just those simple things can be so powerful for morale. And then, of course, often forget that logistics chain behind the process. So, really interesting to hear that whole sort of piece around it. And the classic, the number of times I've heard people say, send in a drone, this big tech solution. You say, well, where does the money come from? That costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. How many ranges can you have for that? So really good insight. And then sort of moving beyond the direct protection against poaching, just to look more at actually animal welfare and habitat restoration. So we talked briefly before this about the film Love in the Wild and the elephant sanctuary that you support. So maybe if you could just tell us a bit more about how you protect the health of both species and their habitat.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start quickly just with the Elephant Orphanage Project, which is a project of Game Rangers International in Zambia, and it's an incredible project. I mean, we're primarily not a welfare organisation, despite absolutely recognising the need for it. And there are some incredible organisations that are solely focused on that. We very much are established to support wild populations in their natural habitat. But one thing with the Elephant Orphanage in Zambia is, ideally we would make ourselves all redundant because there wouldn't be an issue, but there is a rise in poaching, there is human-wildlife conflict, and where humans have been the cause of orphans, and obviously their mothers have been poached, and a lot of times it's through hugely traumatic situations, then we do feel the need to intervene and to give these orphans a second chance. But it's always with the view for ultimate release and rehabilitation back into the wild, so it's never for lifelong care or to keep them in an artificial situation. Because with elephants, it's very different, with other species. So I'm just using elephants as an example here, but they've set up an incredible program, and it can take up to 10, 15, 20 years for an elephant to fully rehabilitate. But they're herd animals, so it's very much around rescuing them at a young enough age, because they would never rescue a fully grown adult that's happy to be on their own. That sadly is just a natural process that has to happen. But when these calves, there was a rescue on the weekend, for example, for 2 elephant calves where the herd had gone into a community area and they had been scared away, and 2 of the calves got lost. And I think they're saying they're around 4 to 5 months old, a male and a female, and they got totally separated from the herd. They spent a couple of days trying to relocate the herd and trying to find them, and to ideally naturally bring them back together, but that wasn't meant to be. So they rescued them on the basis that they are at the age where they wouldn't survive without human intervention, and because it was human caused as a result of the human-elephant conflict, they've stepped in. So they now get taken to a nursery facility in Lusaka, where they get 24 hours round the clock support in terms of weaning, milk formula, until they're old enough, where they then get translocated back to the national park in Kafue, where it's very much an organic and hands-off program. So it's absolutely not a tourist or a sanctuary as such. It's very much a working conservation program on the basis that they don't want to leave these elephants with a sense of reliance on humans. So they limit the interaction as little as possible, bar obviously emergencies and medical, and making sure that there's very few keepers who have that relationship, on the basis that ultimately they one day want to be released. And what they don't want to do is then every time these released orphans see a human, they automatically gravitate because they make the association with food or with comfort. So it's a really scientific process that they go through from rescue, rehabilitation to release, but it's having some incredible successes, and it really is giving these animals a second chance at life in their natural habitat where they belong, rather than shipping them off to some a concrete zoo, or having to just leave them without that opportunity. So it's an incredible program. It's very much done organically and holistically, with the welfare of the elephants absolutely at the forefront. So that film, the Netflix film with Krista Davis, was incredible at raising awareness and shining the light on what happens in some of the processes. And she was amazing at working with the team to make sure that the elephants in no way were stress induced, or they were not put under any pressure. So they used a lot of CGI, and they used a lot of automated I'm not sure how puppet elephants, to make sure that absolutely the welfare of the elephants were absolutely at the forefront, rather than just for the benefit of making a film. So it's an incredible project, and it's a great flagship project to raise awareness. A lot of people won't necessarily connect to a poaching crisis or a poaching issue, or they'll switch off, or they don't want to necessarily see that brutal aspect. But what the orphanage does is it absolutely, everyone, you can't not fall in love with a baby elephant wallowing in a little mud pit. And so it's a great ambassador flagship program to highlight some of the issues and to why they are there, which is as a result of human-elephant conflict. And then moving, Richard, on to the kind of general health of the ecosystems, and such a topical question now when we're in a global pandemic as a result of our misuse of and our abuse of our relationship with nature. We are absolutely about investing in projects that protect wild species in their wild habitat, and it's about making sure that some of the most pristine wilderness areas, which are shrinking around the world and dramatically reducing, are protected as best as possible. And so there's been some incredible projects, and we've worked with some amazing people, for example in Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan with the Snow Leopard Trust, where it's absolutely around working with the government to ensure that mining licenses, for example, aren't given or are revoked in areas of significant importance for some of the most important snow leopard populations in the world. And that's been really successful, and they've realized that actually by investing in those areas, we have to protect that. And again, in India, protecting some of these protected areas and making sure that the encroachment is managed as best as possible. It's vital to ensure that populations are given a chance at surviving, not just in zoos and sanctuaries, because if their habitat disappears or is seriously threatened, whether it's through bushfires or human encroachment, or the conversion to agricultural land use, for example, it has a huge threat. And most of the species that we work with, it is through human-induced threats, and a lot of that is through land conversion and agricultural use, for example, whether it's painted dogs in Zimbabwe, who are hugely threatened now because huge swathes of land that they would normally use as their home, are being converted to community areas or to forests or to agro facilities. So it's a balance between obviously making sure that humans and communities can survive, but without impacting the health of our ecosystems. And as we know, some of the most important wilderness areas, whether it's the Amazon, they are vital and imperative for the health and survival of our own planet, which therefore means us as well. So there's a lot of incredible programs, and we, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, recently funded through some initial seed funding the conversion of working with the government and some local partners, the conversion of an old hunting concession, which has now, couple of years later, really seen such an incredible positive benefit for snow leopards coming back into territory, and it being now a prime potentially location for not only for breeding populations and for viable population growth, but also just ensuring that these wild areas are protected, which is imperative not only for wildlife but for us as well.
Yeah, and interesting that link, isn't it, that actually we tend to cause harm to wildlife without realizing that's also harming ourselves. And so getting that relationship and back, and I think particularly as well what you talked about with the orphanage being, it's about getting animals back in the wild, but also a different way to engage people, the sort of softer, that cute elephant, but then still having that wider message behind it, is a really interesting insight, and looking at those different ways that we can actually engage people. And
that engagement piece is key, as we were saying earlier before we jumped on this call. Before, at least now everyone knows what, every boardroom and businessman knows what a pangolin is, because it's caused the reason why we're in a global pandemic. And I think our relationship with nature and protecting wilderness and wild habitats is absolutely intrinsically linked with our own survival. So it's something that it's been amazing to see over the most, challenging last few months that the world's eyes are on the health of our planet and the environment now. And actually there's definitely kind of a movement and much more awareness as to why it is so important to protect these habitats. And a lot of the time, the species that we're working with specifically, they're apex predators or they're keystone species. So if those species are struggling, they are absolutely indicators and the litmus test for example, the health of the forest or the viability of whichever environment they're living in. So it's a really good way of, if you see those numbers plummeting, then absolutely you won't have a healthy ecosystem, because it's all so intrinsically linked, and which is linked to human survival as well.
And that leads us well on to the next question, which is all about education. So, we know we're always told education is vital throughout life, but certainly in a conservation context. So maybe you could talk more about what you do both in the field, but also in the UK as well, in terms of education.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, that's the third of our pillars. It's vital, whether you're talking about education of, in, for example, at ground-based locations, so around working with local communities so they better understand the implications if you are caught smuggling a pangolin, or if you are caught engaged in poaching. A lot of the time they have no idea that if you're caught just holding a pangolin, there are serious ramifications, whether that's through jail time or fines. So it's working with a lot of local communities to empower them very much to see a positive benefit and positive relationship. It's also around working with different, even educating in this country, for example, working with people so people are aware of the scale of the problem. It's also working, a lot of work that we do is based on demand reduction campaigns in Asia. So it's working and educating communities as to that there are no medicinal benefits to, consuming rhino horn. It's the same as eating your own fingernails or your own hair. So there's a huge amount around that changing cultural beliefs and consumer behaviors, which is a huge education piece. So it's not always just about, working with schools in Africa, which I think a lot of people assume. There's so many layers to it, and it is absolutely key, whether it's educating all ages and all areas. It's about making sure that the conservation narrative and the environmental debate is understood, it's constantly considered, and it becomes much more part of everyone's daily lives. Whether you're a business operating in somewhere in Africa, you have to be aware of your environmental footprint and how that impacts, as we were talking about the poverty alleviation, how that's not only impacting the local communities but the local environment, and what that footprint looks at to your consumer behaviour around consuming rhino horn, pangolin scales, bear bile, buying ivory. Or working, for example, in the UK, in this country, around, why is it important to care, and why should governments, for example, be much more aware of the scale of the problem? Because, the financial implications of wildlife crime for governments is huge, and for businesses investing. So it needs to be absolutely considered at all of those levels. So when we talk about education, it's very broad, but it is so important. We run an incredible competition over here called Global Canvas, which I think this year had over 5,000 children took part in it. And I think it was from 26 schools from all over the world. So whilst we host it here, it's global, and it's wonderful to see. Basically a children's art competition that celebrates using the creative platform, because obviously art is part of our DNA, around using the creative platform to engage children, to have those conversations which would either not be necessarily in the curriculum or taught in school, but are on everyone's lips. Everyone's heard of Greta, everyone's heard of climate change. And it's giving children and adults an opportunity to communicate some of those messages through art, which is sometimes much more digestible. It's easier to look at. You don't have to read a kind of an endless, very few people will read a doctrine on the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, but they will absolutely engage in art as a way of telling that story. So Global Canvas, which I was talking about, is a wonderful way of children to get creative and to have conversations, and to force conversations then with parents who are then helping, or with schools or with art groups, and that culminates in an exhibition at the Natural History Museum, which is wonderful for the kids. So they all come down, and again, it just creates that conversation, that debate, which is so important. So education for us is absolutely key. You're inspiring the wildlife guardians of tomorrow, and it's wonderful for us. The amount of people that do come and they say, I was first inspired, or I first heard about David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation because your grandfather came and spoke at a school, and I remember him saying, what's the most dangerous animal? And everyone would say, tigers or bears, and he'd say, no, it's man. And the amount of people that still remember remember, 30, 40, 50 years down the line, engagement, as children, you've got such a wonderful way of communicating that hasn't been, influenced by so many external factors. So education for us in the UK is a really important thing. So we offer a lot of free school visits and workshops to schools, groups, art classes, just to make sure that children are talking about it. And ironically, most of the time, they're far more up to scratch as to what's going on in the world and the environmental issues than a lot of adults who, you get distracted by daily life. So again, that's another part of what we also like to do, is when we are talking to our, whether it's corporate partners or supporters, it's just making sure that everyone is a source of information and can then digest and disseminate that information so far and wide. So it's really imperative, whether it's children, adults, or like I said, whether you're also working with, that kind of from rather than top down, but across, from working with schools in Africa around making sure that they understand the importance of elephants on the ecosystems and how they can benefit, and some of the employment benefits that come with that, so they can grow up to be an elephant keeper, for example, rather than a poacher, to working with consumers and some amazing organizations like WildAid, for example, who are working in China and Vietnam in terms of reducing demand. It's absolutely one of the key tools if we're going to end up fighting wildlife crime and having some success. But it is a long-term strategy, because behaviour change in education, it takes a while to sink in. And it's also then taking what people learn and trying to convert that and catalyse that into action. But that's why children are so great, and things like the art competitions are incredible, because they have so much more imagination around taking something that you've just said across a classroom and just making it into this incredible visual representation as to why wildlife and conservation is so important.
Yeah, and they're really interested actually hearing the breadth as well that you talk about. As you say, right, it's so easy to think, oh yeah, education is the education program out on field project or whatever, whereas actually it's so much more than that. And also the legal issues, like with that example you gave of holding the pangolin, actually linking them back to community conservation to make sure people aren't accidentally getting in trouble. So you provide that support and you can reduce the conflict to the consumer side as well. So the sheer scope of that I think is really interesting. And then maybe that just builds quite nicely into the final question, which is what we're often the one that's never talked about, which is corruption. But we know it's such a big problem. So maybe just finish on that, sort of how does corruption contribute to the illegal wildlife trade and undermine really all the other work you're doing? And then what are you doing and that law enforcement piece to help clamp down on?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a topic that isn't spoken about, as you say. It is a very delicate one. And of course, it is a fine line, because when you're working with governments to try and help and empower them, it's very difficult to then, wade in a certain way that will then close the door to you. And I think it's important to separate, and one thing that we are very conscious of doing is we have a huge amount more power in terms of being vocal and a little bit more controversial around and open about talking about things like corruption, which is rife and is a major issue in wildlife crime. Because we're an international organisation, we're not operating on the ground, so we very much respect and are conscious of the implications of anything that we say or we do, for example, on ground-based partners. So we would never put, we can speak from an international voice, which means we are much more able to point fingers and to challenge and to support investigations that look at uncovering certain areas of corruption, and whether that's official or unofficial. Whereas, for example, if you're operating in a country in Africa and your partner is the Department of Wildlife or is a national park department, you have to be incredibly careful about how you operate, because operating in Africa, they have different laws and regulations. So if you call out the wrong person who's in a position of power, they'll just close you down and you'll never be able to operate and you'll get kicked out of the country. And then your long-term conservation impacts are hugely damaged. So it's about just trying to find that balance, that you'd never put someone or our ground-based conservation partners, for example, in a difficult position where it would jeopardize their long-term operations on the ground. And a lot of the time they get, for example, if there's an incident if there's a big culling incident or if there's big poaching incidents, a lot of supporters can jump and say, well, why aren't you being more vocal about this? Or, how outrageous this is operating, this is happening on your doorstep. But a lot of the time they have to be very sensitive to saying, by us making one statement, we could get closed down and never operate again. So actually, is it more beneficial for us to be able to just work with them in a very empowering, encouraging way to try and help push out corruption in a manageable way, and then we can then become as an international voice. We can then be the voice who says this is unacceptable, and to write petitions and to sign letters to governments and to call out. You know, we do a lot around the EU, for example, with the ivory trade. We are very vocal around how appalling it is and how slow the EU has been to close ivory markets. You know, we're way behind China, who everyone thinks is, you know, the bad person in that scenario. And yet, you know, the UK, we're still going through legal processes at the moment where small groups of antique dealers, for example, are trying to overturn the new implementation of the UK Ivory Act. We can be very vocal and we can absolutely say this is unacceptable and that we need to be doing more. So it's definitely recognising who are the key voices in that space who can call out corruption, who can highlight major areas of weakness, and who can have those conversations at a government level where it's not going to then jeopardise ground-based work. So I think it's recognising that and being very conscious of it. But it is also being brave enough to have those conversations. You know, a lot of people on the ground are doing incredible work, and sometimes they are operating in systems that are underfunded. There is an abuse of power, there's an abuse of where the resource goes. It doesn't always end up in the right place. And it is really difficult, but they're doing, you know, the best they can in challenging environments. And so for businesses, for example, businesses have a far stronger voice in terms around saying we have a lot of influence, for example, operating in this country. We can absolutely be the voice to get to a much more senior official, for example, to say this is a problem and you need to deal with it. So it's just being a bit clever with the solutions about how you deal with it, and also not being afraid to talk about it. A lot of the projects that we work with, they're so well established now that if they ever get hint or, you know, or a kind of a wind of anyone who is operating correctly, they themselves will absolutely alert you know, the officials, and because they've seen the benefit that the conservation projects and the partners are bringing to their livelihoods, to the impact it's having. So it is a really delicate balance, but it does need to do more. You know, it's as we said, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Behind human trafficking, drugs trafficking, and arms trafficking, wildlife trafficking is the next biggest one, and it destabilizes economies. It tears the social fabric. It is such a destabilizing factor, and governments have to start paying attention to really tackling down, because the economic losses and impacts of wildlife crime on the country as a whole, not just on the national parks and whether they have any elephants left, is huge. And I think we're starting to see the implications of that now as a result of COVID and what's been brought to light, and that you can have much more access to media now. And I think that, you know, that is one benefit to the rise in social media. It's, you know, it can be a negative as well, but it's far easier to anonymously call out people and to highlight issues and to raise major issues of corruption. Now you do regularly see exposés into corruption of whether it's leaders or whether it's wildlife departments, or leakages of ivory stockpiles, for example. You know, there's a lot of the corruption comes in so many different formats. And one thing that we do, for example, we fund a lot of undercover investigations that look at the trafficking routes, and they then work very closely with a lot of the departments in government to pass on information. And they are very cautious to who they pass it on with, but they also have started working much more with financial institutions. So, for example, anti-money laundering departments, and so they're looking at asset tracing, they're looking at asset, you know, financial kind of asset freezing and the implications of that. So it's definitely getting much more sophisticated, and I think the conservation sector is waking up to the fact that this has to be an approach where, when you are dealing with these big criminal syndicates, you are working with different sectors. So whether it's working with the financial institutions or different government agencies beyond just your traditional one who you would go with, there's definitely a rise. And I think it is an issue, and it is always going to be an ongoing issue where there is a value on a product. You know, wildlife products have become a commodity. They're almost the new blood diamonds. And of course, the moment you put a financial value on something in a place or a location where there is poverty and there is, you know, major disparities between wealth, you are always going to have that temptation. So if we can take away the financial implications and the financial value of wildlife products, then I think we would, by, you know, ending the trade or reducing the association that, you know, ivory has a value, then you're always going to see that, because it is such a high value commodity. You know, rhino horn can be more than gold on the black market. So you're always going to get undercover and black market smuggling and corruption in that. So it's about being brave enough to have the conversation, but in the right arena with the right people, and making sure that you're not jeopardizing operations on the ground where, you know, if they got closed down, then you would just see a scourge in poaching, and actually you'd lose really key, important, strong populations.
Yeah, that's interesting, is actually to flag up how you manage the process and that sort of real world view, that even if something's wrong, actually you've still got to look at that long-term process and how do you solve it. What is a long-term problem anyway? How do you solve it over that long-term period?
Yeah, you're much better working with someone than working against them. You'll get far, you know, and it is frustrating, but we've seen you get far better results if you have a positive relationship with a difficult government or a difficult department than if you just absolutely, you know, and there is a time and a place when things come too much where you can absolutely, but that's where you have to have all the different elements working at different angles. Yeah, it's complex issue with complex solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks very much. That's the questions that I wanted to go through today. So yeah, I think really useful not only to look at each of those individual 5 elements, but actually how they intertwine, and then also the complexity you've brought out in each of those areas and the multiple sort of facets to them, which I think is very easy to forget. And as you brought out a lot of it, it's simple to think rangers and drones and things like that, whereas actually, you know, just boots and raincoats can be more important.
Well, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to join you, and also obviously to Tunza, who give back so much to conservation and the efforts on the ground. So thank you.
Oh yeah, well, thank you very much, Georgina Lamb from David Shepherd Wildlife Foundation.